Hello, and welcome to another Lunchtime with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. Today we're going to be exploring the restoration technique of sphagnum moss transfer. These talks are brought to you with funding support from the Community Foundation for Ireland, and we're going virtual with support from the Irish Environmental Network. Who are the Irish Peatland Conservation Council? Well, we're a national charity whose mission is to conserve a representative portion of Irish peatlands for people today and future generations to enjoy. We're based at the Bogavalla Nature Centre in County Kildare. We own and manage in partnership 5 peatland nature reserves nationally: Lodge Bog in Ullymore West in County Kildare, Fenner Bog in partnership with the Moyne Finuirc Development Association in County Waterford. We own 8.5 hectares of Gurley Bog. This is a natural heritage area which is over 100 hectares in size. We own it in partnership with National Parks and Wildlife Service, Quilcha and private landowners. And we own a blanket bog, Code Bog in County Kerry. Our work includes peatland site conservation, species monitoring, peatland policy, research and education and awareness. The Save the Bogs campaign is guided by Peatland Conservation Action Plans. The charity has developed 7 since its foundation in 1982, and the latest Conservation Action Plan is called Peatlands and Climate Change Action Plan 2030. This should be read in conjunction with the Peatlands and Conservation Action Plan 2020, halting the loss of peatland biodiversity. You can learn more about the work of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, how you can support it, and indeed how you can get involved by visiting our website www.ipcc.ie. What is a peatland? Well, peatlands are also called bogs, and they're wetlands. They contain 90% water and 10% dead and decaying plants, and they once covered an area of over 1 million hectares on the island of Ireland. They're acidic in nature. Peat is the result of the accumulation of partially decayed plants over thousands of years. The dead plants don't decompose because they grow in waterlogged conditions where there's little oxygen, and this prevents bacteria and fungi, the agents of decay, from working. Healthy peatlands have a water table within 20 centimetres of the surface throughout the year. Sphagnum moss is the main peat-forming plant, growing 1 millimetre a year and storing 20 times its own weight in water. As a result of the little oxygen and lack of decomposition, peatlands are extremely nutrient-poor habitats, and they're also resulting in plants being very low growing on a peatland habitat, so they're an open landscape. Peatlands have many values. Traditionally, they were valued only for the peat beneath the surface. However, today we know so much more about the values of Irish peatlands. These are referred to as the ecosystem services, the benefits people obtain from nature. The ecosystem services that Irish peatlands offer include a rich and diverse habitat for biodiversity, water regulation, carbon storage, a source of food, recreational opportunities, and inspiration to artists and poets. Seamus Heaney famously described them as Ireland's unfenced country, an economic resource, a land bank for agriculture and forestry. For you to assess the condition and quality of your local peatland habitat, a number of key indicators within the habitat should be surveyed for. And this is our peatland habitat assessment. Using these indicators, you can determine the condition of your local peatlands. This will allow you and your community to draw up a restoration plan of actions to improve the peatland hydrological conditions and restore its ecosystem services. So what conditions are you surveying for? Well, first, the cover of sphagnum moss. Is there evidence of bare peat? Is there evidence of drainage and drying, grazing or burning? Is there evidence of planting trees on peatlands? Is there evidence of invasive species or turf cutting and peat harvesting? Before you will undertake any restoration activity on a local peatland, you first seek permission from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and advice from your local heritage officer. And indeed, if it's privately owned, do indeed speak to the local landowner. So what are the features of an active raised bog? Well, it's peat forming and the driver is sphagnum moss. There's a continuous cover of sphagnum mosses up to 50 centimetres deep. Active peat formation is a rate of 1 millimetre per year. Sphagnum mosses make up the peat to a depth of between 4 and 6 metres. The water table is at or near the surface for the most of the year with little water fluctuation. It's gently sloping and there's a continuous supply of water. Water on a peatland is actually received through rainfall. So when we look at the gentle slopes are critical for peatland formation. This allows a slow seepage of the rain. Severe slopes would mean the rain would rush off the peatland surface. Gentle slopes give time for the sphagnum mosses to absorb it. This is a profile of a healthy raised bog. It's got a typical hummock and hollow profile on its surface. The upper active layer with plant growth and decay in oxygenated, acidic and wet conditions, and the lower layer with more or less stable conditions, acidic, anoxic, that is without oxygen, little decay, and it's kept saturated by protective upper layer. A high cover of sphagnum mosses is also present, and specialist bog plants such as sundews, bog asphodel and bog rosemary. And the water table is at or near the surface. On the ground, this is what it looks like: an open landscape, low growing plants, and a hummock hollow system. Hollows are the wetter areas of the bogs, while hummocks are the drier areas. In reality, however, peatlands in Ireland have been affected by, as we know, drainage and drying, afforestation, trampling, overgrazing. So many peatlands in Ireland today need a helping hand, and sphagnum moss transfer is one method of us helping to restore our peatlands. So, what is bog ecological restoration? Well, it's the re-establishment of the hydrological regime by blocking ditches, drains, and improving the microclimate conditions. Re-establishment of a typical peatland plant cover, including sphagnum mosses, a key species for the functional peat accumulating ecosystem. So the sphagnum moss transfer is actually a Canadian method. In Canada, research allowed them to discover that transplanting sphagnum moss onto areas of bare peat under the right hydrological conditions and indeed acidic peatlands could be restored within a 10-year period from once a bare, open landscape to a landscape covered and peat forming in sphagnum mosses and allowing newer peatland plants to emerge. So sphagnum moss can be considered under the correct hydrological conditions. So for successful sphagnum moss transfer and for you to consider it on your local peatland reserve, you must have a water table within 10 centimetres of the surface. So prior to undertaking any sphagnum moss transfer, you'll have to assess the water levels on the peatland. And don't forget, your peatland also needs to be acidic in nature. So measuring the pH is important. So with your site selection, as I said, you first need to know where the water table is. So this should be monitored for a whole year. The white tube in this image is known as a piezometer. In a previous talk, as part of this Lunchtime with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, we actually explore water level monitoring on our peatland sites. And I recommend you watch that video. Remember, the water table is ideally within 10 centimetres of the bog surface and it requires bare peat. Your site selection will also, if you look at the image here, show you that it's selecting an area of bare peat where the sphagnum moss has been lost. Next, you will undertake, after understanding that the correct pH of the site is present and also the water table is sufficient, you will select your site and complete a baseline vegetation survey. This will be recorded in a 2 metre by 2 metre quadrat and is to sample the vegetation present prior to any restoration. This can be repeated after 3 years of the sphagnum moss inoculation, and if successful, you should see a vast improvement in the actual plant cover on the area. The next thing you need to do is to carry out a site profile. Remember, the peatland to be successful in functioning and the growth of sphagnum moss, it requires gentle slopes. So in our case, we used simple spirit level and meter sticks to profile the peatland surface. Oxidized peat may need to be removed depending on the results of your profile. The chosen sphagnum moss that's often transferred is Sphagnum capitifolium. This is cherry red or green. It's hummock forming, it's moderately peat forming, and it can withstand fluctuating water levels, and it's relatively common. The collection of Sphagnum capitifolium is fairly straightforward. You're going to inoculate in a ratio of 1 to 10. You will, for a 5 by 5 metre restoration plot, collect 10 centimetre depth from 10 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre donor sites. What happens to the donor site? Well, sphagnum moss reproduces using spores. So from your 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre donor site, and remember, you're only taking the top 10 centimetres off the sphagnum moss. There's sufficient spores left in the area. So the donor site will regenerate, and you can monitor this annually. The images here shows on the top right-hand image there, the donor site after removal of the sphagnum, and 1 year later on the left. The next steps, so the peat surface preparation. Following your profile, you may take action regarding the slope of the peatland. Oxidized peat will be removed, and then you're going to inoculate with the sphagnum, and you're going to cover with straw. The purpose of covering with straw is to retain moisture. So what happens? The Irish Peatland Conservation Council have trialled sphagnum moss transfer on both Lodge Bog, one of our nature reserves in Kildare, and a cutover area of Gurley Bog in County Meath. This on Lodge Bog is an example of the cover of sphagnum moss after a 5-year transfer. This is an image of Gurley Bog in 2015. On the left, you can see we had lots of bare peat. We inoculated with sphagnum moss around this wet hollow on the cutover area. And you can see 3 years later, the straw has decomposed, which again, the purpose of which is to retain moisture initially and allow sphagnum moss to take hold of the surface. And you can see there, as I said, on the right in 2018, the sphagnum moss is now accumulating. There are always problems, and these should be noted. First off, flooding. When during the profiling and removal of oxidized peat, sometimes there can be errors occur. And if too much oxidized peat is removed, it can result in the water table now reaching the surface and flooding your inoculation area. Remember, the chosen sphagnum moss within the transfer is often Sphagnum capillifolium. It does like moderate fluctuations in the water table, but it can't be submerged for the whole year. And another factor, which is something that we must consider indeed with the climate change crisis we're currently going through, is drought. Sphagnum moss needs water. Remember, water is the lifeblood of a peatland. So remember, having the correct hydrological conditions is really important so that any drought conditions that might be experienced will have little impact on the transfer area. So what is our restoration timeline? Well, in days and weeks, we'll improve the physical conditions. In weeks and months, we'll improve the chemical conditions. Months and years, improve the biological conditions. And years and decades, it'll be the topographical changes you'll observe. In the next lunchtime with the Irish Peatland Conservation, we'll be exploring the large heath butterfly. So join us then. In the meantime, you can support the work of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council by joining as a friend of the bog. You can do this online at our website, www.ipcc.ie, or indeed calling the centre on 045 860 133. We're here to help. For now, thank you for taking part and exploring sphagnum moss transfer with us today. You can keep up to date with our work by visiting our website, ipcc.ie, or indeed following us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and indeed Instagram. For now, farewell, and once again, thank you for learning about the wild peatlands of Ireland.